And by the way, when folks were talking about, taking notes, remember that these screen recordings do exist. I know it's like sort of a pain to like scrub through them and find the relevant bits, but you can't, if you get good at like scrubbing back and forth, you can pretty quickly find sometimes where we typed the code and then just listen to like the voiceover for that one little bit. So keep that in mind too if you're like trying to like go back and figure out why we did stuff. Okay, if you're listening only on the screen recording, just a quick recap. This is about 2:15. We just spent a couple minutes kind of talking about the general direction of the course and like where people want to go from here. But we'll loop back to that later on. Okay, so maybe for now, we'll do a couple more of these little demos, talk a little bit about functions and objects and stuff. So if you were here last week, this should be kind of where you are right now. I think we stopped with demo 10, right? Is that where everybody is kind of picking up from last week? And I think this should be the code that you have from last week if you were following along. If not, you can maybe catch up or quickly implement this as I'm finding my place here. Okay, so let's see what else we might want to do with this stuff. So one thing, so we were talking about maybe doing mouse clicks, but actually one thing we also haven't done really, we've gotten key presses in the sense of like, we're waiting for a key press to like stop the task, but we actually haven't like used any key presses either, right? Which is probably something important that you might want to do in a lot of cognitive tasks. So let's look at how you might do that actually. And we already actually have imported CyclePy event and use this wait keys function, right, to like just wait for any key press to end the script. And that's actually what we're going to use to record a key press too, if you want to like record an actual response. So let's see. So all right. So first of all, if we want to record a key press, if this is like an IAT type task, what line-ish in this script would we be wanting to insert some code where we get a key press? Yeah, presumably after we show the images, so that would be about approximately what line? Get everyone used to like reading the structure of this code again.
32.
Well, so so probably 31 would be at the very end of the. I guess this depends actually, right? So like I guess it depends what our task is going to be. So if we want to show the picture and take it away and then wait for a key press, we could do it at like 30, like after line 30, right? Because there's two flips right now in each trial, right? So one is 25 and one is line 30. So line 25 is when you put the text and image on the screen, right? And then like line 30 basically just puts the text on the screen. I think ideally, because right now at least we're putting the image up for 500 milliseconds, like that's probably enough time for people to respond a lot of the time. One thing you could also do is like put the picture up and get a key press if people press while it's up, but then also take it away after 500 milliseconds if they haven't pressed yet, and then record during the next period during the ITI. That's complicated. So instead, let's assume, and I think this is the way probably most of these kinds of tasks are structured, let's assume that instead of just waiting a set amount of time when the picture is shown, we just leave it up until people make a response, right? Because that's a pretty common way to do various tasks. So let's do something real simple for now, which is just replace that core.wait line with getting a key press, and that's pretty much the same as so that's pretty much the same as what we did at the very end of the script in line 26, right? Except the difference is what between what we're doing. What's that? Well, yeah. So it's gonna wait. Yeah, it's gonna wait after each image. But what is another difference in what we do with that waiting?
There's no time limit on the wait.
Well, there's no time limit, but there's no time limit in the other case either. I mean, there's a difference from what we were doing just now, but what's the difference between the wait keys we're doing in 26 versus 33?
Making them an object.
Well, yeah. So we're saving. Again, we haven't really talked too much about what functions do and how this all works, but the difference, right, is we put something equals scipy.event.wait keys, right? So we're saving some output from that function. And again, we'll get more into functions in a bit. But that's the difference, right? Is like here we have resp equals. Here we're not like, we're just telling it to wait for a key press. We're not actually like saving any output from that. And just to see what we get when we do that, let's add like a print line at the bottom and just tell Python essentially to print out whatever resp is, which probably clearly stands for response. Let's just print whatever it is. And that's going to print actually to, let me actually just resize my window here. It's going to print to this output tab, right? Because like that's where text stuff goes in CyclePy. All right, so let's run that and see what happens here. All right, so I'm going to hit some keys. You see it's waiting until I hit a key, key, doesn't matter what key. Right now, I'm just hitting a bunch of keys. All right, and now we're at the end of our task, and we wait for keys here too, right? But we're not saving that one. And what do we get down here in our output? Or what do you notice about this? I mean, look, these are all my key presses. You know, and I was just kind of like counting my hand down randomly. So that's what we get. Apparently a lot of F's and J's and S's. What's going on here? What do you think happened in that particular? So that was I was sort of hoping that would happen, but wasn't sure. What happened at that point, do you think?
Press 2.
Yeah, I hit 2 at once, which is actually kind of tricky to do because like as soon as it detects a key being down, you know, it's gonna stop waiting, right? So like it has to be really, truly pretty simultaneous. But there I must have hit the D and the S key kind of like in between at exactly the same time. And it said I had 2 key presses there. So that's a little weird. And the thing to kind of extract from this, well, there's a couple lessons here. We've talked a little bit, just a very little bit about things that look kind of like that does, right? So like up here where we've got the display resolution, you know, 1280 by 800. I think before when we talked about for loops, right? Because here you've got for face num in range 10. I think when we first started talking about for loops, we might have entered something like that. And we said, all right, well, if you put range 10 in, what we get is this list of numbers from 0 to 9 surrounded by square brackets. So what have we got here in the output? We've got like basically a list of 2 things, right? So when you see in Python multiple things inside square brackets surrounded by, or sorry, in square brackets with commas separating them, that's like a list, right? That's a list of items. And so that's maybe not what you want in most cases, right? Because like you don't usually want all the key presses pressed at once. I mean, maybe you want to know that people did, so you can just like throw out that trial or something. But if you want to be lazy and just take like whatever, you know, one of them or something like that, or just get rid of the bug that you might get if you are expecting just one and you get 2. I don't think we've done this yet. So let's go back to the shell. So let's say I want to make a variable out of like this range of 10. So let's just say like nums for numbers equals range 10. And if I just print out what nums is, it's that same list. So if I want to get like the 4th item in nums, does anybody remember or know how we might do that? I can't even remember if we've talked about this. You went over it a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think both things.
So does anyone remember how we might get like the 4th element of nums?
Bracket 3.
Ah, excellent. So nums, oops, bracket 3, right, is the 4th thing, right? Because it's 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Because again, we count starting with zeros, so this is the 0th, but the 1st element. You know, the 2nd element, the 3rd, the 4th, but we use the 3, right? So those brackets are also used to like index into this list, right? So if we want to just like say, forget about it, we're not gonna, if somebody presses 2 keys at the same time, that's fine, but we only want to save one of them. We could do something like this, right? Which is the 0th item, but it's, you know, really the 1st thing in the list. And so now if we get multiple keys pressed simultaneously, we should just get the first one. So let's try that and see if we can do that. So what I'm going to do here is try to always hit like multiple keys at the same time. And in theory, we will never get multiple key presses now. All right, so I hit like 4 keys at the same time every time there. All right, so I was hitting like H, J, K, and L all at the same time. And what you see when that output comes out, right, is we only got one of each. And also, you'll notice that the square brackets and the quotation marks go away, right? Because now it doesn't have to tell you that this is like a list of little strings. It's just telling you like, all right, this is just this individual letter in a string, and it doesn't bother to surround it by quotes if it's not telling you like this is a number of items in a list, right? It's just saying like, all right, here's the J, here's the H, and so on, right? Does that still kind of make sense to everybody? I mainly did this because like I had like a really thorny bug years ago, and it was actually in Psych Toolbox in MATLAB, where like I was testing to see what the response was, right? And what I wasn't anticipating is that sometimes you might get 2 items back for what the response was if somebody accidentally hit 2 things at once, and every time like MATLAB tried to do that, it would say like, no, you can't compare 1 thing to 2 things, and it would crash, and it was driving me nuts. So, so this is one way to get like just the 1 item out of your response list, right? Okay. So does that kind of make sense to everybody what we're doing there? And actually, like just to maintain parity with the code I was kind of writing for myself, let's just compare and contrast the difference between these. So if we like, well, we can talk about one other little thing when we do this. Oh, that should be fine there. And actually, let's just add one other thing. Oops, sorry. All right, so let's do this. So basically, I just repeated this print response line. So what is this little chunk of code going to do when we run that? And let's say I keep trying to like hit multiple keys at the same time.
It'll print whatever you actually originally input, and then put a space, and then print out whatever the 0th position in response variable response is, or first thing. So it would show you the first key press.
Yep. And this is, I think probably, again, since most of you guys have some experience, this is maybe not super confusing. I found that this kind of like stuff is very confusing to people that haven't programmed before sometimes because they see like these 2 lines of code are identical and they think they should do the same thing, right? Even though you're actually changing things in between, right? So, one thing you always have to keep in mind if you're not as experienced is that the computer is kind of like executing these lines in order, right? You have to kind of mentally simulate what's changing, right? So we get this potential list of keys, print out that list of keys. And this kind of line is also very confusing if you haven't done much programming before. So, right, you are basically like reassigning the name rest for response to refer to a portion of what it previously was, right? Or a different kind of, so like previously rest was a list, but what you're doing really is getting the 0th element of that list and then assigning that to the same variable name, right? Does that kind of make sense? So you are destroying the old variable and just putting like a different thing in its place, right? The same thing as if you say like a equals 5 and a equals a plus 1, right? So if we do that in the shell, you can say like a equals 5. Let's see what a is. It's 5. A plus 1 is 6, but a is still 5. But if you said a equals a plus 1, a is 6, right? That makes sense to everybody? Like, does that blows some people's minds, I think, and I always forget that. Like, it's so obvious if you've been programming forever. But it is weird, right? Like, it's basically like saying, if I cut my arm off and name my arm Matt and throw away the rest of me, like, that's the new Matt, right? That name now refers to, or you have like 10 items in a box and you throw away 9 of the items, but like leave the same label on the box, right? Like if we use that variables as boxes metaphor. So anyway, this I think confuses people if you're new, but if you guys are not new, it's probably not that weird. So yeah, we take just the first response, make that the new thing that response refers to, and then print it out. And then afterwards, we just print a little space afterwards. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so here, I'm going to hit 4 keys at a time again. Okay, so that's, oh wait, that's interesting. So you see that I did not succeed in actually hitting these all simultaneously a lot of times, but I did several times. Right, so it gets the list, and then it takes just the first item in the list and prints that out, and then it separates them nicely into little chunks, so you can kind of see how that works, right? And of course, if this were a real task, you could then like save these responses and write them to a file or something like that, right? Or make some decision based on what people responded or whatever. Okay, any questions so far? This like super basic response collection stuff makes sense? All right, cool. Well, maybe then let's do a couple. These are like pretty small changes. So probably another thing that's like super relevant if you haven't done CyclePy before, but use cognitive tasks. Probably another very key thing you might want to do with this stuff is not only get what the response is. Oh, thank you. We could probably also. So we might also not want to measure just what the response is, right, but also what the response time is, right? We might want to know like how long it took people to respond. So there are various ways you could do this, but we'll just do one of these ways because it's pretty intuitive, I think. Maybe we'll break this into chunks so we can kind of see how this works. So let's add like just one line right here. All right, so you might be able to guess. So we've already got CyclePy core imported, I think, because we use it for some other stuff. We use it for waiting, right? So CyclePy core has got a lot of timing functions. One is get time. So let's take out some stuff here. We don't really need a whole list of responses. And let's print. So let's keep printing what the response was. And let's just print what the response time is right now. And just kind of see what that is. You'll be able to guess that haven't done this before as to what we're going to get when we print this time. What do you have any? What's that? Well, we hope it's the response time. Let's see. I may have cheated slightly.
Did you made a response time for like the whole thing, not for like individual key presses?
Depending on what you mean by the whole thing, I think you are verging on. Yeah, it's going to be. So the CyclePy.core.getTime, if we can guess at what those numbers mean, they're going up, right, with every little response. So
it's cumulative.
Yeah, it looks like it's cumulative since the start of the task, right, in this case. If people have used ePrime before, this might look familiar, right, because like you usually get like your RT time, but you also get, I think they call it like the .RT time field. There's like an extra T in there. And in that case, I think ePrime is measuring it. I can't remember if it's since, I think it's since the script was started. But different timing functions do it differently. Like I think Scite Toolbox does it since the computer was turned on. Sometimes you get it in like seconds since 1970 or whatever. Regardless, it's like a global time, right? It's not time since that stimulus came on screen. So that's not exactly what we want, probably, right? So if we wanted response time, though, here's a little algorithm question. Oh, that's a pretty simple algorithm. Like, what can we do to get what we want, as opposed to like this cumulative thing?
Subtract this subtract the response time from the past trial from the response time.
Well, so if it's the one from the last trial, though, we'll get time. We'll get how long it's been since the last time they responded. But that also includes all the stimulus presentation. I mean, you're in the right like ballpark, but what else?
Ideally, we want the time from when the stimulus appears on screen.
Right.
Button press.
Right. So it's a weighing the cat problem, right? Like if you guys are familiar with that, like you can't. It's hard to like. You've got to weigh yourself, then weigh the cat, and then subtract. Weigh yourself, then weigh yourself holding the cat, then subtract yourself from the combined weight to like get the cat weight, right? So basically, the moment the stimulus comes on screen, right, is right after that flip occurs, right? So that flip will show the stimulus on screen. So what we really want to do is make a second variable. We'll call it maybe like presentation time. And then let's print out the difference between the time they responded and the time that the stimulus was presented. Right, so that makes sense to everybody? So just going linearly through. We flip, so we show the stimuli. As soon as possible after that, we get the current time. Then we wait however long we have to wait to get a response. As soon as the person has responded, we record the current time again. Then we do some other stuff, print out the other response. And then we'll print out the difference between the response time and the presentation time. Let's see if that gets what we would usually call our actual RT. So let's see, wait a long time for this one maybe, so third trial should be a long one. And these will probably all be about the same, probably pretty short. All right. So this looks promising, all right? So yeah, first couple trials a little shorter, third one was kind of longer, so that's good. And a bunch of little short RTs at the end. All right, so that's pretty good. This is in seconds. Any thoughts on if we wanted this in milliseconds? What do we have to do? That might be a little bit easier way to read it.
Remote.
Yeah. This is a classic thing that like I always find myself doing. It's like, you forget sometimes because like lots of functions return things in seconds, lots of other functions return things in milliseconds. So you often find yourself like, I have to divide this or multiply this if I want this in the right units. All right, so that's a little bit more intuitive maybe is to see this in milliseconds, so that's pretty good. And one other thing I'll throw in just for now, and we'll talk about what this means a little bit later. Let's like annotate this a little bit more nicely so it so you tell kind of what's going on. So let's say and I think we did a little bit of this very early on, but we didn't really spend much time on it. So let's see what this, let's just call this RT for short. So I'm going to add, you might want to be careful about your quotes, but let's see if we get that. Hey, get that all fixed up right. So let's see what that's going to look like. Then we'll kind of talk about what it means in a bit. So I'll go through our 10 trials here real quick. All right. Oops. Oh, wait. That's just a general timing warning. That's fine. Well, fine-ish. If we're running a real task, we might care how good our timing is. All right. So it prints out a slightly more nicely formatted like response, colon, and what the key was, and then the RT, colon, and whatever the number was. So that's kind of nice, right? That might be helpful for annotating what you're actually doing. And maybe we'll just, does it kind of at least vaguely conceptually make sense what this is doing, even if the notation's a little funky? Do people see like kind of how this is sort of working, that it's printing out literally the word response and the word RT and a colon, and then it's doing something to append onto the end of that, like the things that we were just kind of printing out bare before. Is that?
Why do you need the format statement?
Well, we'll talk about that. There are various ways to do this in Python. We'll maybe talk about that in just a minute when we talk about objects a little bit more. But does everyone sees kind of the general thing that's going on, right? Is that like part of that, like the part inside the quotes gets printed literally, right? Except for that part that is, like, it's not literally printing that braced 0 in either case, right? Instead, it's like replacing that with what's inside the format function. Everybody cool with that?
You showed them the percent symbol.
Oh, that's right. I think Josh used a different way of doing this. Yeah, I prefer this one, and it kind of leads into the discussion. But yeah, there's like a couple different ways of doing this in Python. So yeah, maybe we'll table the question of why exactly we say format and that dot, because that'll lead back in a second. But all right, just so everyone conceptually gets that. And then I think I only had, let's see if this last, oh yeah. So this, well, we've got a couple other little demos, but I think they like branch into the larger question, which is like talking a little bit more about these concepts of like functions and objects. So let's maybe go here. And it did get a little bit tricky to kind of think about functions we could write based on just what we have so far, because there's not a whole lot here to like turn into a function. But let's talk a little bit about what a function is. So I'm actually going to, we've used some functions before, right? So, or things that look sort of like functions, like psychopy.core.wait, right? So, that's a function that just makes the program wait for 300 milliseconds, right? Because we gave it a 0.3. But we have not, Josh, you didn't write any of your own functions, right? When we were, like we talked about it a little bit afterwards last week, but not in the actual session. So let's insert something maybe like right around here before we, let's say general, well, let's actually put this line up here. Sorry, general, can't spell apparently. General task parameters, just to like kind of annotate what section of the code we're in. Let's put a little line here for function definitions, and then like everything below this chunk will be like main script or something like that, just so we kind of like have our little areas set apart with comments a little bit. All right, and I'm going to define a function. This was more useful actually before we kind of changed up our format to record responses, but let's pretend in the older version of the script, and maybe I'll just open that up just to show you. We won't necessarily revert back to that, but there were a couple of things that were repeated, right, or like nearly repeated. So for example, like here we had a couple of instances where we had 2 lines in a row where like we flip and then we wait a certain amount of time, right? And these two pairs of lines are not exactly identical, right? Because they're waiting different amounts of times. They're structurally a very similar thing that we were doing, right? Which is flipping the screen and then like waiting a certain amount of time. Now this is like a very super simplified, dumb example. So don't read too much into this. This is probably not worth writing a function about in reality. But you can imagine this is like a pair of things that are commonly done together, right? And that you could reasonably say like, well, a pretty common thing I might be doing when I'm writing code is like flipping the screen over to the next thing to show and then waiting a certain amount of time, right? You might imagine that's like a pretty common conjunction of activities, right? So you might say, well, maybe it's worth, actually, it would save some lines of code if we could express each of these things in just like one line of code in theory, right? And that's one way to think of what a function is in its kind of simplest form. So let's write a function that does that and see what that would kind of look like in context. So let's delete, not delete, but close that tab just so I don't forget which I'm in. So let's make a function, and the name of it will be flip and wait, and we'll explain what this means, or what all this notation means in just a second. So what we're doing here is we're making a function, and I know we haven't talked too much about what a function actually is yet, but you can think of it as like a self-contained chunk of code that you can execute from elsewhere in the script. But the name of that function is flip and wait. The keyword that you put in front of one to let Python know you're defining a new function is def, like I'm defining this function. That's a pretty uncommon way to express it. Like a lot of languages have, like MATLAB uses the word function. Other languages just do it implicitly, but Python calls it def, so you just have to know that. I think it would make more sense to call it like func or something, but whatever. And then we have a couple of these parameters in here that look kind of like this notation that we've used before when we were like creating objects, or when we were calling functions down here, like core.wait, and we put some value in parentheses, right? So same kind of notation here. And then the key thing is, remember, you need your colon at the end. That's just kind of like an if statement or a for or a while statement. You need a colon at the end. We're going to actually do a couple very simple things. Put in win.flip and psychopy.core.wait in sex. Oops, sorry, no semicolon. And that's going to be a very simple function. And maybe, because we're good coders, we'll actually start commenting our code a little bit and say 2 input parameters, a window, and a delay in seconds. Okay. And again, I know like for some of you that haven't used these function type things before, this is still looking pretty weird, but hopefully as we use this, this will start to make some sense. So So if we just run the code as it is, let's actually demo this. Let's put the first thing in this function being print. I ran a function. So if I just run this code as it is now, when is it going to print out that text?
Never.
Good. You found the trick question. Okay, well, I don't need to run it if you got it right. So yeah, the answer is never, right? Because we had defined that function, but we haven't actually used it anywhere, right? So I think the analogy I used last week and I often use is like a function is sort of like a machine and a factory, right? Like it takes some stuff in and it can spit some stuff out and it can do some things along the way. But you've got to actually turn it on, right? So like here we have kind of built a machine. We have built a flipping and waiting machine and told what you have to feed into it to make it do stuff. But we haven't actually run it, right? We're like building a car but never turning the engine on, right? So we have like built this thing and it's there for us to use, but we haven't actually used it. So to actually use it, we got to put it somewhere else in our code after we've defined it. So the place where we flip and wait here, again, remember there used to be kind of a flip and wait up here, but now we're waiting on a key press. So this example became less relevant after I thought about it because I then inserted the response time collection in there, but whatever. Let's say we're going to put this flip and wait right here. And we said we need to give it two things. We need to give it a window. Well, there's only one window we have, right? And that's represented by the variable myWin. Oops. MyWin. And how long before we flip? And I don't even remember what we had. We have 0.3 seconds. I think that's what we said, right? So now, if we run this, hopefully what we should get is the same exact functionality as we had before, but a nice little, I ran a function every time that wait and flip thing happens, or flip and wait thing happens, right? So let's kind of look at what's happening here. So there's a couple things going on. This is probably weird to you if you have not used functions before. Does this basic idea make sense to people, or is this like just totally wackadoodle to people? I don't know. I remember when I taught this before, this was like totally mind-blowing to a lot of people that had never programmed before. So the basic idea of what's going on here, right, is we have some kind of reusable chunk of code. Again, I like to use the factory machine analogy, right? So you have a machine, but the machine, it doesn't just like, you could have a machine that just like does something when you turn it on, right? That doesn't require any kind of additional raw materials. But oftentimes you need some raw materials, right? You need to like put a couple things into the conveyor belt for it to do anything useful, right? So here, for example, if our function is like flip and wait, it minimally needs to know like what window it's flipping and how long it's supposed to be waiting, right? And then this might be a useful thing to call, because if you have some long task with a bunch of different like delays and everything built in, you're gonna have a lot of like flip and waits. Maybe if you're showing like imagine like an RSVP type paradigm, right, where you show like an image and then wait and then flip, show an image and then wait. It might be convenient to roll those all into one line of code, so you don't have you can just like have a bunch of flip and waits, and it saves you like one line of code every time you run it, right? It just looks a little cleaner in that case. But the thing that might change every time, right, is like maybe it doesn't change what window you're flipping that much, but you still have to know which window to flip. But one thing that's probably changing each time, right, is how many seconds to wait. So you need to specify those two things. Those are the two kind of inputs to the machine, or the two kind of little conveyor belts that lead into the machine. And then you specify that when you call the function, right? So when you flip and wait, you give it myWin, you give it the number 0.3, but you could really give it any window here and any number there, right, and get like different behavior. Is that like kind of clear what's happening? Yeah.
So in the function definition, how does it know what you're assigning to win and what you're assigning to sex?
Excellent question. Not exactly the question I thought you were going to ask, the question I was hopefully leading to, but that's close enough. So by default, it's ordered, right? So it's just what order you put them in. This is where like Python gets weird. So like if we switch these, it would just probably bug out and give us some kind of error. Oops. I assume it's just going to crash on us. I think that's what it would do. Okay, yeah, it's like, what? That's a number. It can't flip. Yeah, that makes no sense. It has to be a window. Right. So by default, and I think this is, the most common way in most programming languages, is like the first thing and the second thing get assigned to the first thing and the second thing respectively, right? And this kind of relates to what I thought you might have been about to ask, which I know has confused some people before, is the idea that here we have two things called win and in-sex, not insects or anything else. If we were teaching Site Toolbox, one of the things people love to talk about is that the get the current time function is called getSex, and the wait a certain amount of time function is called waitSex, SECS. But anyway, here, no. Here we just get time. So we're calling these two things something different, right? Here, this thing is called myWin, and here it's called point3. Then we use them, though, up here as when and in-sex. So that blows some people's minds, I think, that we're using different names to refer to the same things. But what you can think of this as is, I don't have a good, real-world analogy for this, I guess. But, here we have a window that's called myWin, right? And essentially, and a number that's just explicitly specified as the number. What flip and wait does when it takes these parameters is it accepts, you're sending it basically this object and this number, this window object and this number. And it's slapping its own labels on these things, right? So it gets to call them whatever it wants. Just so long, it's like holding out its two hands. Now it's not a machine, it's like a robot, I guess. It's saying all right, give me, in this hand I need a window, and in this hand I need a time. And the function, whatever's using that or whatever's commanding it to run, is just giving it these things, right? You give it these things in that order, but then the function gets to take hold of them and say, all right, I'm going to call you win, and I'm going to call you in-sex, regardless of what they were called before. Does that kind of make sense? So this win here that we say win.flip is the same window as the one that we call myWin down here, and in-sex refers to that same number 0.3, that we just call with the literal number 0.3 there, but we give it different names up here. Is that sensible to people? Yeah.
You can also explicitly spell it out that you are defining win to equal myWin and sex to
Well,
equal
That was
whatever
gonna
you're
be
Yeah,
my
that-
question. Can you do it out of order then? Can
Well-
you do it in other languages or not?
Yes, and I hate this because I don't even I think this is more confusing the way that Python lets you do it, but yes. So that was going to be the next point, but I sort of hated to even have to introduce it. But does that basic idea make sense so far to people that that it's okay that this same window is called two different things in two different places because, all right, everybody cool with that? It's, okay, let's just, if that is confusing, that's fine, but we'll go past it for now. So yes, the tricky bit is there are other ways to specify this, and I'm only showing this to you because we use this notation already elsewhere. Otherwise, I would just sort of pretend it wasn't the case. But let's say, well, this kind of leads into, there are a couple different things here. So if we always specified all these arguments, it would, a good way to do it would just be to always do it in order, right? But you might have seen before, we do something like this when we created windows and image stems and stuff. But if you remember, we didn't always specify, we don't have to specify what the height of the text is or whether or not it's bold, right? We could take those bits out and it would still, that function would still create a text stem for us, right? So the way that that's working under the hood is you can specify what the default value for something is. So let's say the default value for the number of seconds to wait is 0.8 or something like that, right? So now, if I don't do anything else, if I run it just like this, how long is it going to wait each time that function is called? Wrong. I gotcha. That's the trick question. I was hoping you would say that, but no. Right. So, and this is a weird way to say it because, again, I don't like the way that you express it here. This really makes it look like you're saying, make this in-sex equal to 0.8, right? That's what that means everywhere else. What it really means is make n sex equal to 0.8 if they don't give you something already to be n sex.
Matt, I don't know if you thought I meant explicitly
Oh, no.
in this section. I meant in the actual function call. You can explicitly.
Oh
say
yeah,
that.
I'm building to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm building that with the logic of this because like otherwise I don't think.
So if you wanted to do a variable flip time, could you make a new variable that says random something something random flip and put that number in there and that's what it calls until the
Actually, I'm not sure.
Huh.
I don't know if you can put active.
on literals.
That's what I thought, right? You can't. Yeah, it has to be
Okay.
just a literal number.
you can't put variables in
Yeah.
there.
I don't think so. Just because
I've never tried actually, but well, we can. Well, let's. All right.
It can't be like a self-contained execution code.
Like, I don't think that'll work. I think it'll just complain. Yeah, I think it has to be like a value.
I mean, I think you could do
Oh,
that.
maybe not. Well, actually, so it's letting me run the code, but it's still we didn't actually take out the telling it that it's 0.3, so it may not be complaining yet. So let's do this, and then we'll like get back to the point I was about to make before that interesting question was asked. So let's see if this runs actually. Ah,
You're welcome.
thank you. So I guess we're wrong. I didn't think you could do that either, but apparently you can.
Well, that's still
Let me guess.
returning. That is returning a literal.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's returning a valid.
I think as long as it's getting
Well,
a literal.
Can we?
But
So
I
like,
don't know if you can set it to like a variable.
well, you can't set it to a variable because no variables exist yet in that function at that time, right? Except what else has been passed in. But could you set? Oh, or you're talking about like a variable elsewhere in the function? Wow.
No, like here you can't set n sex equal and then what some other variable that's used somewhere else.
Well, let's try. We can try this too. This is actually, these are questions that I've never actually bothered to ask myself because this would be a weird way to do things, but it's not bad ideas to see like what you can do. Oops, let's take out the false sex. All right. Let's try that and see if that lets it run. Now look at all these things we can do that we didn't know we could do. All right, so that waits a half a second. So yeah, you can refer to another variable. The weird thing about function definitions, we're getting into all kinds of stuff that I was hoping you would never ask about.
Sorry.
So yeah, so this function flip and wait can see any of these other variables that we define up here. Because these variables are basically what we call global variables. Essentially, they're variables that exist at like, they're universal to all the code inside the script, right? Which is different from variables that are defined inside a function. So like if we have these like parameters that are a kind of variable, or if we just define another variable in here, like a equals 5, like code outside this function would not be able to use that variable a that we defined here. Does that make sense to people? Because like this function, it's one of the things about functions is they are self-contained. Like think about, again, the machine. Like the code outside the machine can send stuff into it and take stuff out of it potentially, but it can't like look inside and see what that function's doing on the inside, right? Like you with your human eyeballs can look at the code and see that. But like code outside this flip and wait function could not use the variable a that's defined inside of it, right? So like basically anything inside that function is created and destroyed within that function. And unless it explicitly sends back a value like out the other end, you can't see it. Now, the difference is this is kind of a one-way thing. So like the function can kind of see anything that's just sort of globally defined outside of it, right? So now, again, I don't have a real-world value. Well, I guess like the robot analogy kind of works, right? Like you can tell the robot to do stuff. The robot can like see what's going on around it, maybe use that information, but you can't see what's going on inside the robot. Or it's like telling a human being to do stuff, I guess. Like that's an easier analogy, right? Like the human being can see all the like global environment that surrounds it, and you can tell that human being can do stuff and they'll do it, but you can't necessarily see what's like going on inside that human being to like make that happen, unless you probe it with psychology or neuroscience.
Are the indents there under the def is I'm going to beginning to define this function and I know all the things. that's, the indents under there is everything that's contained within that function. So if we started a new line that was not indented, it would know, well, that's the end of the function.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, it's just like, I think we talked about this when we did like for loops and if-thens. Same idea, which is like Python, and Python's weird this way, like most languages are not this way, like defines like chunks of related code with indentation. So everything that like shares a certain indentation belongs to the same function or the same if-then, set of instructions or the same for loop or whatever. So whenever we go back to non-indented code, then we're like outside that function again. Yeah.
That's the end of that group or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is weird. Most languages have like a more explicit way of demarcating the end of the function. Like MATLAB uses, well, MATLAB's weird. You don't actually have to, but you can say end.
Yes, there's some ends in.
We're going to wrap up soon, but if you need to
yeah.
catch up with us a little bit. Yeah.
Usually anything that you do Python code in will have some marker on the side for like, what's contained and where it
Yeah.
starts. That little minus checkbox, if you click it, it'll just squish
Oh, yeah.
everything and hide it.
Yeah.
You probably
Usually your code editor, even though this file that you're making is just, all it really is text, right? You could open this up in any text program. Yeah. Like CyclePy is doing you the job of like interpreting your raw text, and I don't know if we even talked about that. Like if you've never coded before, this is maybe not obvious that like it's not like Microsoft Word where like you have to make something bold and purple, right? Like you're just saving like regular text that has no formatting, but CyclePy Coder is doing us all this interpretation and like marking this up for you. I always forget stuff like that. That if you haven't coded a lot before, that's not. You're like, why is every time I type this word, it's a different color? Obviously, CyclePy is interpreting that raw text for you. So anyway, why are we talking about that naming stuff? Oh yeah, because we had all right. So we've gone like way beyond like what we meant to say. The whole point here is that you can have default values, right? So if we went back to what I was originally going to say, which is like if our default value for this is 0.8, then if we just call flip and wait and only give it a window, like that's totally cool. It just says, all right, I'm just going to put in. You didn't give me a number of seconds, I'm just going to use this 0.8 that I already have like lying around, right? But if you send it in that 0.3, then it says, all right, I don't have to use my 0.8 that I was going to use. I'll just use like this 0.3 that you told me. Is that everybody cool with that general idea? And that leads up to another consequence of this, which is if you want to only specify some of these things and you don't want to care about what the order of them is, you can actually do something like this, I think. I can't actually remember if this is going to work, but I think it will. I should put a 0 just for good practice. Let's see if that actually does work. Okay, yeah, so that works fine. Right? So it doesn't yell at us for putting those out of order like it did before. It doesn't yell at us like it did before when we put those out of order, right? And the reason is...
Better way to show this example is you would need like 3.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a super... Yeah, this is dumbed down to the point where like it may not make sense to you why we would do this. But you can think of this as like saying, all right, I'm gonna, you're a robot now, and you're like, whatever. You have some function, and you're like, all right, can you put like, I'm a cheese cutting robot, and the robot for some reason has no eyes, and it says, this is a very contrived analogy. All right, I'm a robot. Like I'm expecting you to put a knife in my right hand and a block of cheese in my left hand, right? And if you just do that, if you give it 2 things, and it goes, like this. That'll work as long as you give it the knife in the right hand and the block of cheese in the left hand. If you reverse them, that is not going to work, right? Like doing the same motion with a block of cheese to a knife as you would do with a knife to a block of cheese is not going to cut the cheese appropriately. But if it's a smart enough robot, presumably, and you say like, hey, actually, I'm putting the block of cheese in your right hand and the knife in your left hand, like if the robot knows which thing is going in which hand, then it can like, appropriately assign those things to the right places and do the right job. That's a super dumb analogy, but the basic idea here and I do not like this about Python, sort of. There's a lot of reasons why this is kind of ugly usage, but it is true that if you explicitly say, all right, I've looked at the definition of this flip and wait function, and I know that you want two things that you're going to call when and nsex. I could just give them in that order, or I could just give them in the opposite order as long as I tell you which thing to put in which place, right? So you kind of have the option as the person using that function to put things out of order, but tell the function on the other end which thing you're putting in which place. Does that kind of make sense to people?
Where's the code that says, hey, I'm switching the order?
Well, it's not saying it explicitly, but what it's saying is, so before what we had is we just put in like the word my win and the number 0.3, right? And what we're doing here instead is saying in sex equals 0.3, and what that refers to is in the definition of this function, like we know because we've looked at this line of code, that it's expecting something that it's going to call in sex. Now, normally, if you don't explicitly specify that, it would be the second thing, just gets called n sex. But in this case, we say, all right, just for fun, I'm going to give you the number of seconds as the first thing, but I'm going to explicitly tell you that by saying n sex equals 0.3. Now, if I've committed to doing that, I can't just I don't think I can anyway, I can't just give you the window as the second thing and have it expect to figure that out. Now I need to tell everything explicitly. So I need to say, all right, and now the window, the thing that you call win, I'm going to give you my thing, my win. Right? I know this is super confusing if you haven't done this
So
before.
it's like if you just don't know the order
Or
of
if you
what's
don't-
in the function, then you can do this.
Or
to
if
make sure
there's
you
like a lot of stuff. So
Yeah.
like, if there's a function that's actually calling like 10 things, it's really useful if you can just define it instead of.
Right, and this is kind of where I was hoping to build to. So, psycho pi image stem. Right. So Ingrid's got it. So if you remember, here's what we do when we make an image stem, right? We call what's basically a function to create an image stimulus, and we give it a window and a file name, right? And you notice here, the first thing we give it doesn't have an equal sign, but the second thing does, right? Everybody see that? So let's look at the definition of that thing that you use to create an image stem now in PsychoPy in its documentation. You don't have to really understand this too much, but this is basically, it's technically part of an object, but it's the same kind of deal. This is like the equivalent of that first line of our function definition, where here are all the things you could put in. You put in a window, actually you have to put in a window because there's no default value. And then something called image, which defaults to none, something called mask, which defaults to none, something called units, which defaults to what looks like an empty string, something called pos, which is the position in the window, which we had actually put in before at one point, which defaults to 0, 0, something called size, which defaults to none, something called orientation, which defaults to 0, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we can put in 20 parameters about that image if we wanted to, right? But if all we want to specify is the thing that we have to specify, which is what window it's going into, so if it doesn't have a default argument, we have no choice. We have to give it something, right? Because it's expecting something for all of these, and if it doesn't have a default value for all of these options or parameters, it's going to crash, right? So we have to give it a window, but then everything else after the window is optional, right? So if we only want to give it a window, and what's the next thing? Well, we actually specify the image. So that's a bad example. But let's say we only wanted to specify the window and the image, and then a size, and skip over the stuff in between, right? So one way to do it would be to give it a window, and then say image equals whatever the image is, and then say in your code mask equals none, units equals empty string, position equals 0, 0, and then your size that you wanted, right? But that's annoying because you have to put in a bunch. You have to rewrite all the default values that are already defined in this function header, basically, or this first line. So instead, what you can do is basically skip anything that you want to just leave the default value for, and then just put in the stuff that you want, as long as you specify what it is, right? Because if you just put in you just call image stem with a window and an image file name and a number, how does it know that that number's not what you mean for mask or units or position or whatever, right? Like you have to tell it. If I just put in like a window and an image and the number 60 for orientation, it doesn't know that 60 goes with orientation unless I explicitly say what the orientation is, right? Does that make sense to people? So like, I mean, we could even do this. So we could just do, like if I just give it like an image file, and I put in like 60, for example, it's not gonna probably not like that actually because, oh yeah, non-keyword, well, this is actually making a different complaint, which is, let's do it this way. This is more valid code. So because the image file is the second thing, we can do this. I'll tell you why you can't do that in a second. I know we're a little bit over, but we're about to wrap up the point. All right. Couldn't make sense of requested image, right? And that's because basically we gave it a window, a file name, and then number 60. So that's interpreting that as saying like a window, all right, our file is this one, we'll call that image. And then it's what it's expecting for a mask. Like a mask is, like kind of an image saying like where certain pixels are. It's expecting like a black and white image or the name of the black and white image there. And instead we gave it the number 60, right? And that doesn't make any sense. Like it's expecting another image file there. So if we wanted to say like, no, we keep none as what the mask is, keep blank string as units, keep 00 as position, we have to explicitly say, no, we actually want that 60 to mean the orientation.
Could you just put a comma and a space and nothing in there?
Oh, like a bunch of empty commas with like blanks? I think you can't do that in Python, can you? That is something you can do in other languages, but not.
Or
I think
like
you can.
just so it knows to use whatever default.
You mean like this? I don't think
Yeah.
you can. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Thank you. No, invalid syntax, yeah.
Well, what you're saying is that if you don't declare any of that stuff, then it's just going to use whatever default is in the.
Right, but the tricky thing is if we just like stopped, so like what we do here, right? Let's even take out the image equals because that's technically not necessary. Like, let's run these two things this way, right? So what this will do is rotate the image. I actually forget whether the default is radians or degrees, but it'll rotate it 60 degrees in some direction if it's image 1, which is the smiley face, and it won't rotate it if it's image 2. But this code should now actually work. All right, so there's the 60 degrees rotated, right? Because the orientation is 60. Frowny is not rotated. Everybody see how that worked? So these are both valid, right? Because like this version, you're just telling it like all the other parameters take their default values, which, for orientation is like no special orientation. We could make everything like different sizes and stuff if we wanted to, different opacities if you wanted to, and so on, right? But if we didn't tell it explicitly that number we put in, that 60 was orientation by giving it the name Ori, we would have to fill in like none, empty string, 00, none, as all the stuff between the image file and the number 60 if we didn't have that Ori in there. Does that make sense? So basically you're saying like, here's a thing that I want to specify a non-default value for. Just like everything else in between, yeah, go ahead and like stick in the default values. But like if you don't explicitly specify the name of every single parameter, basically they have to be in order. I guess. This is like, I hate this so much about Python because it's so confusing if you're a new person to this. Other languages do this much differently. But anyway, all of that is to say, the rule that we got before, and now I can't remember what we did that made that happen. The problem we had before, I think was this. So one reason we got an actual error when we did, so actually let's do this, because this would be a valid value for mask, which is none, right? So this is valid code actually. So let's just show that is. So that's going to do the same thing as the default, because by default you don't show a mask. Like a mask is basically, you haven't used mask before, right? It just like tells what parts of an image to like show. So I think we did like a mask that was like all black on one side, it would only show like half the image. So that's valid code, right? But if I instead said something like what I said before, image equals image file, and then none, this should give me an error. Okay. So why does this give me an error, right? Because, well, let's do it this way, actually. So if I say this, and take out the image equals here, this is totally cool, right? This will run no problemo. So it's not the image equals per se that's a problem. Let's get through the end of that, right? Because it works fine when we put it in that second thing.
Because like once you put in the image equals, it screws up the order, and so it doesn't know where none goes.
Exactly. So what it's basically complaining about when we try to do this is it's saying like, look, dude, if you're just putting in arguments without telling me which, like, if you're just putting in values without telling me which things to refer to, like, I'm going to assume they're in the same order they are in my code that I showed you, is what this function is saying. But if I say like, all right, and that's cool, and what it's fine to do is like do that up to a point, and then say like, all right, I've specified like the first 3 things or whatever just as values. But now I'm going to want to skip around a little bit after this. The trick is, once you've committed to like skipping around by specifying which parameter these values go to, you can't go back to an order-based thing where it's implicit, right? So like once you have image equals or whatever, everything that comes after that in the list has to be tagged with its appropriate name, because otherwise it gets too confused and has no idea like what thing is supposed to get like none. So if I put mask equals, it's like totally cool with that again, because now you've explicitly told it like unambiguously what every value refers to, right?
But it's a go by order or define everything. You can't have both.
Well, you can have both, but the rule, so you can go all by order, totally cool. Like, that's fine if you specify all the variables, or at least all the variables up to a certain point. You can always like stop after some number as long as everything else has defaults provided for it. So if something doesn't have a default provided for it, like when, that means it's required. Like you can't not send in a value for this. Like you can send it, maybe the word none is an appropriate value, or the number 0 or something, but some value has to be given. You can't just like leave it out. But yeah, so you can put in like all, non-named parameters, and it just fills them in an order. That's totally cool. You can, do that and stop after a certain point as long as everything else has default parameters. That's cool. You can specify what every single parameter is in any order you want, and that's totally cool.
With the equal sign.
But what you can't do is have like an implicit thing anytime after something with an equal sign, because once you go into equal sign mode, it's like, all right, well, we're throwing order out the window. Like, so you can start with just bare things without equal signs and say like, all right, the first thing goes into the first slot, second thing in the second slot, third thing in the third slot. But then once you start using equal signs to say like, all right, now my fourth thing though is going into like your 9th slot. Then if you try to put like something in the 5th slot after that doesn't have an equal sign, it's like, well, I don't know now what you mean by that, whether I'm supposed to like go back to this order or, So that's the reason. I hate this about Python. This is probably totally like blowing your mind if you haven't done Python before. But that's the way it is.
I have a very orderly roommate who labels all the fridge shelves. Like,
Yeah. I mean, there's no like great solution to this, which is why like this is probably the most flexible solution, but it's also the most confusing solution if you haven't done this before. Yeah, because like other languages just make you specify everything, or make you have like empty commas like you thought might be an option for everything you want to leave defaults. But yeah, whatever. All right, any other questions before we like stop the recording, and then we can just have private. All right, so actually